Good afternoon. Welcome to Identifying and Meeting the Needs of Adult Human Trafficking Victims, the Role of a Sexual Assault Response Team. This is part one of a two-part series. My name is Maher, and I'm the Director of Anti-Trafficking Initiatives for the Indiana Coalition to End Sexual Assault and Human Trafficking. I am really excited to be bringing this training to SARTs. There's quite a bit of training around the state on working with youth victims of human trafficking, but really not so much on the adult side of things. And we are in the process of building that response around the state of Indiana. We know that multidisciplinary teams are the gold standard in addressing cases of human trafficking. And so we believe that sexual assault response teams are the perfect avenue for identifying and serving the needs of those who've been trafficked and are adults. So thank you for joining me today. We'll be covering a lot of information. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to follow up with me. I hope to hear from a number of you and see you at the second part as well. If you are not familiar with the Coalition, our goal is to strengthen Indiana's response to sexual assault and human trafficking. We do this through education, including primary prevention program, engaging with state legislators on public policies that affect survivors of sexual assault and human trafficking and those who serve them. We promote the expansion of services, and we build the capacity of stakeholders to effectively help survivors and their families throughout Indiana. We provide training specifically as well as technical assistance to rape crisis centers in addition to sexual assault response teams. And we also co-chair IPATH, which is Indiana's State Human Trafficking Task Force, along with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Indiana. And I'll be explaining a little bit more about that piece further along in the presentation. Just a little bit about me. I have been in the public service arena for over 20 years now. 8 of those have been in the anti-trafficking field here in Indiana. I've seen a variety of roles over the years. I've been an attorney representing children in abuse and neglect proceedings. I have represented adults in adult guardianship cases. I've been a hotline attorney for a legal aid organization helping adults in crisis on a variety of legal issues. I have been a regional coalition coordinator with the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, and most recently, prior to my current role at ICESA HT, I was the Anti-Trafficking Systems Collaboration Consultant for the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. So I've seen the issue of human trafficking from a variety of different roles, which I think gives me a very unique perspective. One of the biggest things I do now as Director of Anti-Trafficking Initiatives is I act as the statewide coordinator for IPATH, which is Indiana's Human Trafficking Task Force. And one of the biggest things I'm passionate about is educating people in different roles and different organizations to connect them and help folks work together on this issue so that everyone can maximize their efforts and be most effective in serving trafficked populations. I'd like to say a quick word on the use of the terms victim and survivor before we get into the heart of the presentation. You've likely heard both terms and seen them both used interchangeably in the anti-trafficking field. We generally use the term survivor as best practice because it's a strength-based term and it honors the fact that someone who has been through exploitation has survived very difficult circumstances. However, I will be using the term victim throughout most of today's presentation because it does have legal meaning when we're talking about criminal statutes and statutes having to do with reporting. I do want to note quickly as well that a person who has been trafficked may not see themselves as either one of these, and when speaking with a trafficked individual, it's always best to use the term that they prefer. Our objectives today include reviewing current Indiana law, statistics, and trends that we're seeing related to human trafficking, understanding barriers to identifying and engaging with adult victims and how to overcome those barriers with a victim-centered response, learning about the overlap between sexual assault and human trafficking and the role of a SART, and then finally identifying local collaborative resources. The federal definitions of sex trafficking and labor trafficking are set out under the Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000. That statute has been reauthorized a number of times by Congress, and they have expanded and added to it over the years, but these are the current definitions. Sex trafficking is the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting somebody for the purpose of a commercial sex act, which is induced by force, fraud, or coercion, or in which the person induced to perform the act is not yet age 18. So what that means basically, if somebody is an adult and they are involved in commercial sex, to show that it's trafficking, there has to be a third party behind that where there's force, fraud, or coercion. If we are talking about a minor, so somebody who is 18 involved in commercial sex under federal law, they're automatically considered a human trafficking victim, whether or not force, fraud, or coercion can be proven. So really important to know that. And when we say commercial sex, we traditionally tend to think of exchange of sex for money, but it's the exchange of sex for anything of value. So that can be money, but it can also be food, clothes, shelter, even drugs. For labor trafficking, it's the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining somebody for the purpose of labor or services, again, through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And for labor trafficking, you do have to prove those elements of force, fraud, or coercion for both minors as well as adults. Our state criminal offenses related to human trafficking have a lot of the same pieces and parts of the federal law. They're just broken up into separate specific offenses. And so we have the promotion of human labor trafficking, promotion of human sexual trafficking, then the child-specific statutes of promotion of child sexual trafficking, actual child sexual trafficking, and then human trafficking. And that last one is applicable to buyers of commercial sex. Because we are talking about serving adult victims, the piece of our legislation that I would like to focus on today is the statute on rights of alleged victims. They have some very specific rights, including that they may not be detained in a facility that's inappropriate to their status as a crime victim, nor may they be jailed, fined, or otherwise penalized due to having been the victim of the offense. So for those first two, what that really looks like is maybe you have an adult who's involved in commercial sex work and they're arrested for prostitution, but when in reality there's actually a third party using force, fraud, or coercion to induce them into commercial sex work, they should not be arrested or jailed for that. They shall be provided protection if the victim's safety is at risk. This one is hugely important. Very often, trafficked victims are being threatened by their trafficker, whether it's threatening to harm them, harm their family. If there's, an open investigation and a prosecution going on, it's common to have witness intimidation if the victim is going to testify. And so it's paramount to ensure, and we'll talk about this when we get to safety planning towards the end, but it's paramount to ensure that they are safe, and that if those threats, that intimidation is going on, that it's being actively addressed. And then the last one is that the law enforcement agency shall provide an alleged victim with a completed declaration of law enforcement officer for victims of trafficking in persons. And so this is actually a federal form. If we're talking about a foreign-born victim, this has to do with assisting them in getting a T visa, which is a visa specific to trafficking victims. Under our state law enforcement officers are actually required to provide this form to a trafficking victim. If they don't believe the person is a trafficking victim, they don't have to provide the form, but they do have to provide notice within 15 days as to why they're not filling out the form. So it's important to keep all of these in mind beyond just looking at whether there's been a criminal offense. If you are a prosecutor, it's important to know that restitution is mandatory for human trafficking victims in Indiana, the same as it is under federal law. With the federal statute, they actually provide a formula that can be used to determine the amount of restitution. Under state law, if you look at the restitution statute, there's certain specific things that are covered, but it is still mandatory for human trafficking victims. And then finally, on the legislative side of things, there is a new law in Indiana that went into effect on July 1st of this year. All law enforcement must report any human trafficking investigations to the Attorney General's office. And I've actually included, you can see the link on the bottom of the slide that takes you to the page on the Attorney General's website where the form can be filled out for that reporting. Once reported, an investigator from their office will follow up with whoever made the report. The great piece of this news is that we have a great way to start collecting some data on investigations because it's not something that we have really had before in Indiana. So we're hopeful this starts giving us some concrete numbers on how many cases actually do get investigated and followed up on. When we talk about statistics and data on human trafficking, it's a really hard crime to capture numbers on for a variety of reasons. It's something that tends to happen in the dark. Most of the time, victims do not self-identify or reach out for help. And so, and particularly in the case of adults, there's no mandated reporting anywhere. So numbers that we do see tend to be the tip of the iceberg. The National Human Trafficking Hotline, which is run by Polaris Project, takes calls on suspected cases from all 50 states and then keeps track of those numbers each year. And so I pulled the last 2 years for which they released the data. 2020 was the most recent year that they have out. You can see there in 2019 alone, there was 157 cases of human trafficking reported from Indiana, which was a 19% increase over the prior year. There was 140 cases in 2020, and 64% of those involved adults. And you can, if you go on the Polaris Project website for the hotline, you can pull up your state and see each year where their numbers are at, and then they do a breakdown of, sex trafficking versus labor trafficking, minors versus adults, the types of venues that they're seeing it in. So it gives you a snapshot, at least for the numbers that come through there. But we have no unified state database on these cases. If we're talking about minors, because it's considered child abuse in Indiana, that is a mandatory report to the DCS hotline. And so they are starting to collect numbers on those cases. The Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program, who contracts with service providers around the state, keeps track of youth that are served by those providers, but for adults, there is no uniform reporting. So I will say, just anecdotally, since I have started in this role about the beginning of June, when I started receiving calls for help on cases involving adults, I decided to just keep my own informal tally to figure out what numbers might be out there. I really didn't know what to expect when I started in this role. And so just in a couple months' time, I have been called on 11 cases so far. And that's adults who need housing, maybe law enforcement needs a place to interview victims that they've recovered, people needing to know what resources are out there or how to follow up with someone who's been trafficked. We've even had two survivors call us themselves. So definitely, I think there's more numbers than we know at this point. I wanted to give you some idea of the different types of cases we see around Indiana, and these by no means capture the complete variety, but these are some of the prosecutions that we've had in the state. So you can see that first one, State of Indiana versus Chris Smiley, was the first state prosecution in Indiana, and that involved a 19-year-old who was working in a strip club and was forced into prostitution to pay off drug debts of others. That second one, U.S. versus James Young and Raheem Simmons involved defendants who trafficked both minors and adults out of a hotel on Indianapolis's east side. And they advertised the victims through online sex forums, which is actually very common in sex trafficking. And we do see a number of cases where both minors and adults may be trafficked by the same individual. And so it's not strictly something where traffickers just exploit one or the other. It can be very common for them to exploit both at the same time. Then you have U.S. versus Herrera, Isom, Badger, and Jones. And again, that involves both minors and adults being exploited. They were coerced into prostitution. And then the money that was made from that exploitation was used to fund drug operation on the west side of Indianapolis. And then finally, U.S. versus Rita Law. The defendant forced multiple foreign-born victims into providing commercial sex acts through massage parlors, or what we call illicit massage parlors, because exploitation is going on in them. And those that particular type of operation is something we have seen all over the state, and it's something that pretty much every state in the country is grappling with. Maybe one gets shut down and then they pop up again somewhere else in the state, and that usually involves Asian victims. And so, you have the complication of figuring out how do we get interpreters, how do we find culturally appropriate services and accommodations for foreign-born victims. So kind of the point of all this is that you can see it happens in a variety of different types of situations. There's no just one set circumstance that involves human trafficking. And if you're law enforcement, maybe you don't work sex crimes, but, or somebody in your apartment doesn't work sex crimes, but they're working drug crimes or gang crimes. There's a good chance that they may be seeing human trafficking as well. When we talk about human trafficking, really at its base, what we're talking about is exploiting vulnerable populations for somebody else's gain. And so thinking who is vulnerable, when you look at other societal issues, whether it's domestic violence, sexual assault, mental health, substance use, recent immigration, all of those things leave somebody vulnerable to being exploited. Traffickers know which populations don't have their needs met, and they find a way to prey on them. And so we definitely see a lot of overlap with sexual assault. People tend to think that sexual assault and sexual violence only happen in sex trafficking, but the reality is that it can occur in all forms of human trafficking, whether it's forced marriages, the commercial sex industry, or labor trafficking. If we're talking about labor trafficking, it can look like the trafficker sexually assaulting their victims to keep them compliant and maintain control over them and keep them fearful or punish them for not doing what they're supposed to do. In a servile marriage, it can be somebody who is forced into a marriage and then is forced to provide sex within the marriage, or is assaulted within the marriage. And so we have to broaden our conception of where we think it occurs within the context of human trafficking. But the biggest thing to remember is that no one agrees to be sexually assaulted or trafficked despite appearances. So just because it happened within the context of a marriage or a labor situation where somebody, agreed to sign on to a job and they weren't, it wasn't clear to them what they're actually getting into, that doesn't negate the fact that they may have been sexually assaulted. There's a number of similarities between sexual assault and human trafficking, but there are also some differences that I want to highlight. So for the similarities, anyone can be a victim. Any gender, race, nationality, sexual orientation, or religion. People, when you see things in movies or in the media, you're generally hearing about women or children, but we definitely see male victims, which we don't talk about enough. They can be transgender, they can be foreign-born or domestic. The reality is it can happen to anyone, depending on their vulnerabilities. Survivors have wide-ranging needs. Identification is difficult due to stigma and victim blaming, and the perpetrators use power and control. Where human trafficking differs, one of the biggest differences is that there's multiple perpetrators ongoing, particularly if we're talking about sex trafficking, and you think about the trafficked individual is required to see, very commonly, 10 to 15 buyers a night because they have to meet a quota and bring home a certain amount of money to their trafficker. We're talking about someone who is not only being assaulted by the trafficker themselves, but then being sexually assaulted by the buyers that they have to see on an ongoing basis. There's usually multiple offenses involved, so I know that sexual assault and domestic violence very commonly overlap, but then there also may be visa fraud involved. For example, if it's somebody where the trafficker helped them obtain a visa to come into the U.S. under false pretenses for the purpose of exploiting them, and then takes the visa from them when they get here, and I'll expound on that in a little bit. The abuse and control is used for the purpose of forced labor or commercial sexual exploitation. And then forced criminal activity, which not a lot of people know about this, but in human trafficking, very often a trafficking victim is coerced or forced into committing other crimes during their exploitation. So that can look like having to deliver drugs for the trafficker, or it could look like theft or battery, just a whole variety of things. And so, it may be an adult where they have, a long rap sheet with a whole variety of charges. Those things don't generally happen in a vacuum. And so it's worth looking at what might be happening behind the scenes. When we talk about adults that are vulnerable to human trafficking, you'll see a number of things on the list that are common to youth as well, but there's a few that are more specific to adults. So personal or family history of substance abuse, personal or family history of abuse or violence, personal or family history of mental illness, recent migration, individuals with disabilities. That one in particular, I think we probably have barely started to scratch the surface in terms of raising awareness and being able to identify those populations. We know that there's a high percentage of sexual violence committed against individuals with disabilities, and so there's definitely overlapping vulnerabilities for those adults. Lack of resources, incarcerated individuals. ICASA HT actually has a program called the Criminalization Alternatives Project, where we train Department of Corrections facility workers to be able to identify potentially trafficked adults and get them connected with an advocate prior to release to make sure that they have resources and safety planning for reentry. When you think about it, somebody who's actually been incarcerated for a period of time, when they are let out, very often they have no resources, no job, no support network. They may have no family connections anymore. And so it's really easy for them to be preyed upon. Traffickers actually look for women coming out of correctional facilities for this very reason. Sometimes it can be a situation where a trafficker who's already exploited a woman who's incarcerated has maintained communication with them and is waiting for that person when they get out. Again, if it's somebody who has no resources, no family, and there's really no planning done for them to help them make sure that their needs are met, they really don't have any other options. And then finally, history of being trafficked as a minor. I think when we talk about trafficking victims, we tend to look at children and adults as completely two separate categories, being completely different from each other, when in reality, very often it happens on a continuum. So you can have cases where minors are trafficked into adulthood, or maybe once they become an adult, it's the only thing they know. They don't feel like they have any other options for survival because they have no other resources, no support network, all those same vulnerabilities still. And as I always tell people, it's not like, somebody's a trafficking victim on their 17th birthday and then a prostitute when they turn 18. If somebody's exploiting them, they continue to be a human trafficking victim. And so it's really important to think of somebody, throughout the course of their life versus, just a child or an adult, and they're completely separate. There are a number of different barriers to identifying and engaging adult victims of human trafficking. And I would say the ones on this particular slide are really barriers that are created by the trafficker through manipulation and control and fear tactics. That first one, trafficker has a strong psychological hold over the victim. We commonly see this in cases where the victim believes that they're in love with the trafficker. It may have started as a guy telling a woman, I love you, you're the only one for me, I will take care of you, we'll be together forever, and really kind of, pulls them in with that type of language. And then it's an intermittent making them feel good and mixing that with abuse and exploitation. So maybe, one day it's saying I love you, and the next making them see 10 men a night and bringing home a certain amount of money for their quota, and then giving them a gift, and then sexually assaulting or beating them up. And so this intermittent back and forth creates what's called a trauma bond in the victim's brain, and they are very, very attached to their trafficker. If they're at the point where they have not been identified and they don't see themselves as a victim, and you try to tell them this person is your trafficker, they won't know what you're talking about. They're going to say, that's my boyfriend, I love him, I wanted to be with him, I wanted to do this. They may have trusted somebody who lied to them. They have nowhere else to go. They believe they have a real debt to pay, and they take that very seriously. That can look like somebody being brought into the country for exploitation, and they're told by the trafficker, I paid, $20,000 on your plane ticket and paying for your room and board, and so now you have to pay me back with interest. And obviously, it's an exorbitant amount that they can never quite pay off. They don't know their legal rights, or if they've been lied to about them. They're isolated. They're embarrassed about what's happening to them. They may, it's very common for them to feel shame. They're afraid of detainment or deportation, which plays into that distrust of law enforcement. The trafficker is absolutely telling them, this is your fault. You've engaged in a crime. You're the one who's going to be arrested. And when they do get arrested, then, that just reinforces what they've been told. And they think, well, my trafficker was, or my pimp, or my boyfriend, however they see them, he was right. He said this would happen, and that's exactly what happened. They may have had other, crimes that they were coerced to commit by the trafficker and been arrested for those. And so all of that plays into distrust of law enforcement. They may have had their documents taken away. Again, foreign-born victims, if they're brought into the country, and then when they get here, their visa is taken by the trafficker, and they're told, I'll hang on to this until you pay your debt back, but it's a debt that they can't ever quite pay. This next one, their current exploitive situation is better than the one that they see it as better than the one that they came from. If you haven't been in an exploitive situation like that, it's really hard sometimes to fathom how human trafficking could be better than what somebody may have, whatever situation they may have come from, because it's pretty awful, right? But if we're talking about somebody who was abused throughout their childhood, maybe sexually abused by family members growing up, maybe they lived in poverty and didn't know where their next meal was coming from, or they lived out on the street and had no place to stay for a long period of time. Even though the exploitation that they're going through is, can be violent and full of threats and, being lied to by the trafficker, they still may feel like, well, at least I have a place to stay, or at least somebody is saying they love me. Maybe their family, no one in their family's ever said I love you before, and the trafficker is the only one who said it to them. If we're talking about somebody who grew up in foster care and feels like they didn't have that love of family, and so they may actually view their situation as better than what it was. And then finally, they can't see a way out because of threats or danger to themselves or their family. In addition to barriers like this that are created by the trafficker, there's also a legal barrier to identifying adult victims. Just really quickly before we get to the legal piece, I wanted to take a look at the power and control wheel. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this already in the context of domestic violence. This was actually converted for the use in human trafficking cases by Polaris Project, and again, they run the National Human Trafficking Hotline. But you can see a lot of these same background pieces that you would see in domestic violence, so coercion and threats, intimidation, emotional abuse, economic abuse, isolation, denying, blaming, minimizing, telling the victim that it was their fault, it was their choice, saying nobody's going to want you, nobody's going to believe you. All of these things are absolutely happening in the background for them. And then you have the legal barrier to identifying adult victims. So if you'll remember the definitions that we went over at the beginning of the presentation for both sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and this is true in state law as well, you have to prove that force, fraud, or coercion if we're talking about a case involving an adult. And so in thinking about all of the other barriers that we just took a look at, if somebody is being threatened, they're fearful, or they think they're in love, maybe they don't speak the language, maybe they have a mistrust of law enforcement. And I would add to that not just law enforcement, but it can be systems in general. If they've had been in the child welfare system and been moved from home to home, or they've been through a hospital and nobody picked up on the fact that they were being abused, and they feel like they've been let down by systems, that mistrust carries over to all of those different entities. And so trying to prove those force, fraud, and coercion pieces can be really difficult. For prosecutors, if you ever get a chance, I highly encourage you to check out Jane Anderson at Equitas. She's got a fantastic training on building a case without a victim witness. So for those circumstances where, maybe it's too traumatic for, and this is a lot of cases, honestly, where it's too traumatic for the victim to testify in court. I mean, that can be very re-traumatizing for them. And so how do you build that case with other pieces without the victim witness? So that's an additional barrier. And then the very last barrier that we don't often think about is biases that we may have ourselves, and how are we perceiving someone? Are we looking at them and their circumstances and making assumptions about them? So probably one of the most common ones, if we're talking about commercial sex work, we think of the word prostitute, right? And that makes sense because prostitution is a crime. But, you may be looking at somebody where it wasn't their choice to participate in that. It's something that third party is behind the scenes using force, fraud, or coercion. This one particular study found that 50% of first-time arrestees for prostitution actually met the federal definition as victims of human trafficking. And I would encourage you to think about, even if we're talking about someone who's involved in commercial sex work, that maybe there is no third party, maybe it is prostitution. Being mindful of the fact that very often they have other factors in their background that led to that point. And so a high percentage of them have childhood sexual abuse in their background, and other overlapping vulnerabilities. But again, you very well may be looking at a human trafficking victim. And the downside of, when you automatically think prostitute, you're thinking criminal, because it does have that connotation to it. Another one would be drug addict. So, maybe you're coming across somebody as law enforcement, or in a hospital setting, you kind of view them as a frequent flyer, right? They're constantly showing up high. You're seeing them looking disheveled. They're having a lot of issues surrounding that, and you just tend to view them as somebody with an addiction. But you actually may be seeing something else. So this one particular wide-ranging study on the health consequences of sex trafficking found that 84.3% of survivors used alcohol, drugs, or both during their captivity, and more than a quarter were forced to use substances as part of their trafficking experience. So that 84.3% obviously is very high. And it makes a lot of sense when you think about it. We're talking about individuals who have to endure ongoing, complex, extreme trauma on a regular basis. And so it's a way of self-medicating. I've heard survivors say, it's something they can't get through in their right mind. And that completely makes sense. And then, there's definitely that piece where traffickers may be forcing them to use. It could be giving them something to keep them, awake so that they can work throughout the night, or keeping them compliant. And then something else that we see, and this is, pretty common in Indiana, where we have a huge opioid problem, is a trafficker. Maybe it starts out as a person's dealer before the exploitation starts. And at some point, the dealer says, you can't have your next fix until you bring me some money and do something for me. And so that kind of, lures the person in. And then once they get into that, it's a means of control that the trafficker uses over them, only giving them the fix when they've, had sex for money. And then one other is illegal immigrant. So we've seen a lot in the media recently about individuals coming over the southern border illegally. Sometimes you'll see the term illegal alien, which I really dislike calling them an alien, because it makes them sound like they're not even human. Yes, absolutely, you can have people coming into the country illegally, but what most people probably don't realize is that the majority of trafficking victims who are foreign born actually do enter the country legally. So this particular study found that 71% of the victims held some type of non-immigrant visa status when they entered the United States. And so very often you have somebody here who will help them get their paperwork so that they can come into the country legally, but it's for the purpose of exploiting them when they get here. And then when they arrive, the trafficker takes their visa, they take their identification paperwork, and say, you don't get this back until you pay off your debt to me, or you perform this labor and services. And so it's at that point where the victim falls out of status. And then it also has the compounding issue of them not being able to tell anybody who they are or show they're here legally. So even if they wanted to reach out for help, they have nothing to prove who they are, and the trafficker is absolutely threatening them with, now that you're here illegally, law enforcement's going to lock you up, and they don't know their rights. So again, just really thinking about these things, thinking about individuals you may have encountered over the years in your specific role and how you may have viewed them. And I'm just encouraging you to think about kind of looking at what might actually be going on behind the scenes, because all of these things, these don't happen in a vacuum. There's almost always something else going on behind the scenes that got them to this point. And thinking about that last piece of barriers that are created by our own biases, I actually wanted to include a survivor quote that really highlights that and gives you a really clear understanding of what that looks like. So Polaris in 2018 did this wide-ranging report on on-ramps, intersections, and exit routes for basically how to prevent and disrupt human trafficking in different industries. One of those was the healthcare industry. And there was a number of quotes by survivors on how they were treated in a healthcare context when they did, go to the hospital, and what that looked like for them. And most, unfortunately, were very similar to this. So this survivor says, I had frequent contact with healthcare workers just through different incidents from becoming injured. I was beat up in a hotel room, so I went to a hospital. My cheekbone was fractured, and the nurse was just awful to me, treated me less than human. It was because of the commercial sex lifestyle. That was the thing. So instead of receiving compassionate care, they didn't even give me pain medication. It was just about getting me out of their hospital. And again, unfortunately, there were a number of survivor quotes that were just like this. And I'm not by any means trying to single out the healthcare industry, because this is, true in the law enforcement context, service provision context, of survivors reporting because of how systems looked at them and perceived them. They were not actually treated as victims. So obviously the question, becomes, after looking at all of those barriers, how do we get past those barriers so that we can effectively identify and serve adult victims? And the good news is we can actually do that. That can be accomplished through the victim-centered response. As the Federal Office for Victims of Crime explains it, in a victim-centered approach, the victim's wishes, safety, and well-being take priority in all matters and procedures. I think, on a SART team, most of us know this already, right? When we're working on a sexual assault case, the victim's safety and what they would like to see happen, and their well-being, it is at the center of everything. I think that's, something that we all understand. When we talk about human trafficking, sometimes, it can be easy to forget that part, because now we're talking about, especially with adult victims, if they were criminalized, if they were arrested, is it prostitution versus human trafficking? We didn't understand that piece or get that piece right. Or we're talking about foreign-born victims. We lose sight of that victim-centered response. We tend to start planning our response or think about what should be done without always consulting the victim. And so we want to make sure that the same way we treat a sexual assault victim is the same way that we're treating a human trafficking victim. I wanted to give you some very concrete examples so you can see what that looks like in practice. So that first part is building trust and rapport. Building trust is not going to be an overnight thing. It's a long-term process. We're talking about individuals who have been lied to and mistreated by a lot of individuals. Some of them were people they trusted. It could have been their own family members. If we're talking about familial trafficking, it may have been that and very frequently they have, prior to being trafficked, abuse or other issues in their childhood. They could have been let down by systems. And so, as you can imagine, trust does not come easy for them, and that's completely understandable. So ways to build that trust, you start out by being non-judgmental and respectful. When you think back to the biases and what judgments you might be portraying when you make assumptions and kind of checking those, it will be easier to get past that. Listening to what they say they need versus what you think they need. You may think, well, Obviously, they need counseling, and they're going to want X, Y, and Z, and they tell you really their biggest interest is, transportation, or they need childcare because they want to make sure that their child is safe. Really important to listen to them and make that the primary. What are you focusing on? What is it that they want to do? Ask them, what does justice mean to them? This is hard, but a lot of trafficking victims don't always want to see their trafficker prosecuted. That's not their primary goal. They're really focused on getting resources and healing for themselves. And not to say that, they don't want them to be held accountable. They may not want to press charges ever, or they may at some point down the road once that trust is built and their needs are met. That cultural sensitivity and being trauma informed, that's something obviously you all are going to be familiar with already working sexual assault cases. So providing services, that safety planning, again, very common that, they are being threatened by the trafficker is threatening to harm their family. If they have no housing or food or, stability, and that was what made them vulnerable in the first place, if we don't meet that need, they're likely going back to the trafficker because that's the option they know to get those needs met. Really, really important to connect them with a victim advocate at the first opportunity available. Sometimes that is the biggest difference to a successful investigation and a prosecution. If they can have somebody who's walking through that process with them and explaining it to them and helping them feel comfortable and making sure that their needs are met. Legal services, particularly if we're talking about foreign-born victims, it's really important to make sure that they get connected with that for potential visa protections, such as a T visa or a U visa. And also for law enforcement purposes, there's something, if you don't know this, there's something called continuous presence. That's something that you can get federal law enforcement to help you apply for. And it's a way of keeping them in the country while you're while you're investigating the case. And Indiana Legal Services does have an attorney who works with labor trafficking victims and another attorney that works with sex trafficking victims. And then finally, connecting them with a peer mentor. I recognize, depending on where you're located in the state, this is not always the easiest thing to do because it's not like there's lots of them out there who can be a resource, but there are a number of organizations in Indianapolis, direct service providers, that have survivors on their staff. And so those are really great connections to connect somebody with. You and I, if we haven't been through these circumstances, we can read about trafficking, we can research it, but we really don't know what it's like to walk in those shoes. And so having somebody who can walk alongside them and say, yeah, I understand what you've been through, I know what that looks like, makes a world of difference to them. Because it can be a long-term process in building trust and getting needs met, and getting a survivor to the point where they may want to file charges against the trafficker and go through with the investigation and prosecution, I did include the statutes of limitations. So under federal law, there's no statute of limitations for sex trafficking, and it's 10 years for labor trafficking. And then you can see there I've included the different felony levels for human trafficking offenses in Indiana and the number of years for their statute of limitations. You can see that for child sexual trafficking, that's the only one that doesn't have a limitation. And your local prosecutor will know best what extensions may be possible depending on the circumstances of a case. So things that you're looking for that might indicate human trafficking. I have this listed as red flag examples because there is no one definitive list that encompasses every single red flag. So you may see something that sets off alarm bells. Just because it's not on this list doesn't mean that it's not human trafficking, but these are some of the primary examples to be aware of. So they may exhibit behaviors indicative of trauma, including hypervigilance, paranoia, submission, numerous inconsistencies in their story. Maybe you're interviewing a victim as law enforcement and the story is just not quite adding up. It's not in chronological order. They're sort of jumping around. It seems fragmented. They're not necessarily trying to be difficult or evade you. That is a very common biological response to trauma. Their brain literally can't remember it in the sequence that it happened. There can be signs of abuse, so injuries, bruises, burns, or other wounds in various stages of healing. Really important for healthcare workers to know this. Inability to access dental or health care, poor dental hygiene. It could be, numerous STIs or UTI related issues. I don't think I have it on this list, but if you're seeing somebody who has had multiple abortions or abortion at a young age, poor attempts to treat prior injuries or long-lasting infection that could have been easily treated with a routine checkup, work-related injuries, lack of knowledge about where they are due to frequent relocation, someone else has control over their identity documents or their work visa, they don't have control over their own money. The potential victim is accompanied by someone who seems really controlling. So maybe a person brings them to the emergency room and then insists they have to go into the exam room with them. Or you're law enforcement and you're trying to speak with a person and a third party, again, wants to speak for them. Or if it's a foreign-born victim, says, oh, I can, just automatically offers to translate and doesn't let the victim attempt to answer any questions. Engaged in commercial sex, that one's pretty obvious. And again, not all commercial sex is human trafficking. So if you have an adult who, they can be selling sex on their own. If there's no third party involved, that's prostitution. But again, if there's a third party and there's force, fraud, or coercion, that is human trafficking. Residing in degraded, unsuitable living conditions, so that could be bars on the outside of windows of a house. If you go inside a house, maybe you're DCS or your EMS or law enforcement, and you go in a house for some reason and you see multiple mattresses on the floor with no other furniture or personal belongings, that is a huge red flag. Same thing in the back of a restaurant. If you see evidence that people are sleeping back there, another huge red flag. They're not allowed to leave their place of work. They have to ask for permission to eat, sleep, or use the toilet, and they're not paid for their work or only paid in tips. For reporting, if you are seeing those red flags, always, if somebody's in immediate danger, you want to call 911. That's still the default. If you want to connect adult victims to resources, you can contact or help them contact the National Human Trafficking Hotline. They actually have contacts here in Indiana and may route it to the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program or other service providers. There's also a text number that victims can use. That's 233-733. They created that for those situations where maybe the victim's not in a place where they could safely make a phone call without being overheard, but they could actually text for help. If you suspect a minor is being trafficked, that's considered child abuse again, and that's a mandatory call to the DCS hotline. Make sure that you use the terms human trafficking, say I suspect human trafficking, when you call, because they have a different process they use than other child abuse and neglect cases, and the hotline worker may or may not recognize it as trafficking if you don't tell them that. And then finally, the one mandatory call regarding adults is if you suspect an adult is being exploited and they're endangered. And so you can look at that statute for specific language, but endangered really encompasses those cases where the person does not have capacity for decision making. and doesn't appear to be able to take care of themselves. Okay, so the role of a SART. I know I said at the beginning of this presentation, I'm really excited to be doing this training for you all because in the anti-trafficking field, we know that multidisciplinary team response is the gold standard for addressing human trafficking cases. You have the prosecutor at the table, you've got law enforcement, victim advocates, you have SANEs. You know, over time, you might determine you need to add a few folks, whether it is a victim service provider that works specifically with human trafficking victims, maybe some additional law enforcement partners. But the bottom line is that you already have the foundational pieces in place to build a response to these cases. So I've included this video from the Federal Office for Victims of Crime because it really highlights why a multi-agency, multi-partner response is so critical and the different types of individuals that are impacted by this crime. IPATH stands for the Indiana Protection for Abused and Trafficked Humans. It is Indiana's State Human Trafficking Task Force. It was created in 2006 to prevent human trafficking in the state of Indiana, protect victims, making sure that they receive services, and prosecuting cases. And so you can see that we have this multidisciplinary collaborative approach. As I stated earlier in the presentation, our office oversees the task force along with the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of Indiana. And then in our core committee, which provides steering and leadership, we also have DCS, the Attorney General's Office, several survivor leaders, and then the different committee and working group and regional chairs from the other members. There's targeted committees for law enforcement, victim services, labor trafficking, and the CAPE committee, which is basically the outreach committee and has anti-demand training and youth prevention curriculum. And then you'll see that there are a number of regional coalitions around the state that are members. If you are interested in joining the task force or learning more, definitely feel free to reach out to me and I can talk that over with you. Some additional resources that are really helpful and can support your efforts include the Indiana Trafficking Victims Assistance Program. They provide a number of targeted trainings for specific audiences, including law enforcement, which they do in partnership with the Indiana State Police. They have education specific or training specific to educators. They have a healthcare specific training, a youth worker specific training, and then also training for DCS staff that they do in partnership with DCS. Indiana Legal Services, as I mentioned, has both an attorney that represents labor trafficking victims as well as one for sex trafficking victims. The Resiliency Foundation is a local organization in Indiana that was founded by a survivor of child marriage and provides resources on those cases. Grit into Grace, if you're not familiar with them already, they are a direct service provider based in Indianapolis. They work with women who are exiting the sex industry, and they provide them with community and referrals and resources. I have worked with them on a number of cases, and they've been fantastic in making sure that victims get the help that they need. And then the Taharai Justice Center is a national organization who also works on forced marriages and severe forms of violence to women. They've worked on a number of cases in Indiana and have been extremely helpful. As we look forward to the second part of the training, these are some things to be thinking about in the meantime. Looking inwards and thinking about, does your agency need to have human trafficking protocol? Maybe your agency just needs more training. If you're a law enforcement department, it obviously makes sense for sex crimes officers to get training on trafficking, but it's really important to make sure that general patrol gets it as well, as they might be the only officer who can identify or may come across and identify a victim. Identifying protocol response team, disseminating red flags and protocols so everyone understands what they are and is on the same page. And then thinking about different partnerships, identifying community resources for advocates, mental health services, social services, reaching out to me if there's folks that you want to connect with in the state task force. Maybe it's to understand better labor trafficking resources or other victim service providers that are already doing this work. And then identifying those law enforcement partners that you want at the table. So this brings us to the end of our presentation. I want to thank you for joining me today for this really important material, and I look forward to seeing you at the second part of this series. If you have questions in the meantime, or you need resources, or you just want to learn more about IPATH or what ICASA-HT does, please feel free to reach out. Either send me an email, give me a call. I will be more than happy to follow up. Thank you.